Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us for our fortnightly tech talk, where we try to get our heads around things that are happening in the world of, well, it's not really the world of technology, it's more and more just the world of politics being run through new technical platforms. And it's great to see you all here. We've got a really excited about today, some big discussions around both what the platforms are facing in the US. Even in the last 24 hours, there's been a hearing in the US, one of the Senate committees, which we'll be having a bit of a chat about. Massive developments in Australia, the latest ACCC report, and a whole lot of moving pieces there. We're also really happy to have some of the master's students from Monash University who have been doing research into various parts of technology, and a couple of those students are going to be giving us a presentation later today in some work they've been doing around the COVID Safe app, which will be fascinating to have a listen to. Before we get cracking, respects to traditional owners on the lands we're all meeting. I'm in Sydney on Gadigal land. Pay my respects, as I know all you do, to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise this land was never ceded. Most of you seem familiar faces. If you're new, please use the chat. We want to have an interactive discussion today. I think one of the great things about dealing with these issues are they're complex, and they put up as many questions as they put up answers. Before we get cracking, hi to my regular friends and panelists. Lizzie, who is free in Melbourne. Have you been running around in bare feet in the park like a baby, or what's been going on?
With 9 other people from 2 other households. It's been extremely exciting. Yep, Melbourne has come alive. It's lovely to see.
Excellent. And Dan, who I think is from Perth over in Sydney at the moment, unless you've hedded back after our Chinese meal last Friday.
Yes, that's right. Back in Perth now, in isolation for 2 weeks, in fact. So I can't leave this room for the next 2 weeks.
And that was the price to get over for one Chinese food. That's really, really...
That's how much I wanted to have lunch with you, Peter. That's
it was great. And hopefully we'll all be having lunch together really soon. Now, I wanted to start out today with, I think, the quote of the fortnight, which came from an Australian senior bureaucrat. And I don't want to say who, I just want to sort of put this out there first, just to think about what sort of world we're living in. So this is the quote, and a special shout out to Amy, who's been doing some fantastic kind of real-time research and everything that's going on for us in a fantastic email chain. We'll talk a little bit about that maybe at the end as well. The galactic empire has in fact revealed itself. I say that with regret. We've been trying to work, particularly with Facebook, and we are forming a rebel alliance. Currently, the rebel alliance is the US Department of Justice, ourselves, that is Australia's Department of Home Affairs, the Home Office in the UK, and the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. We are dealing with a galactic empire that has sought to basically disengage itself from sovereign international society. Now, I read that and said, hallelujah, somebody is kind of getting with the program. And then I realized it was Brian Pizzullo, he of the Department of Homeland Security, Border Protection, the whole sort of his Dutton's consigliere. But you think about it, and it seems to me, if you're looking at what's going on around the world at the moment, in Australia, it's the Morrison government. In Britain, it's Boris Johnson. In the States, there's been some significant developments this week, kind of led by conservatives rather than progressives. So should we be worried that this resistance is being fought from the right rather than from progressives, Lizzie?
I am a little worried, I have to say, because I was watching Ted Cruz, interrogating Jack Dorsey overnight in the US, and he was sort of saying things that I would say to Jack Dorsey if I was given the opportunity, and it's not common that I feel an affinity towards Ted Cruz. So it gave me a moment to pause and reflect on that. It's funny that there's these references to kind of Star Wars. If you read Peter Thiel's book, which I've done so you don't have to, but Peter Thiel being the most probably notorious venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, a known kind of right-winger, was on Trump's advisory committee in the wake of the 2016 election. He talks about the divide in Silicon Valley between people who consider themselves fans of Star Trek and people who consider themselves fans of Star Wars. And Star Wars is always the conservative right-wing element of Silicon Valley and tech people, and Star Trek is the other. Anyway, if you're a nerd or you're into those things, you'll probably get what those references are. But framing yourself as a force for light and goodness in the world against this dark evil enemy, you normally wouldn't classify the Department of Homeland Security or Border Force in Australia as being the good guys in that equation. I do think what it comes from also, though, is a real failure on sometimes progressive or centre-left parties on their part in contending with the big power of tech themselves. And this has probably got a longer history than just now, but something like the Obama administration, for example, was a big embracer of technology and innovation in terms of digital campaigning and the like, had strong relationships with lots of the big Silicon Valley companies. And so largely centre Democrats have been associated with Silicon Valley, and now the kind of problems associated with amassing power in those few key companies are coming to light, which gives this big platform to conservatives, I think, to start railing against it. So I'm sort of not surprised, because I think we probably could have done better ourselves in raising some of these criticisms earlier. But it does throw a big challenge as to how you can manage to talk about these issues without looking like a Trumpist or Ted Cruz or members of Border Force. And I think we do want to distinguish ourselves from them if you're a progressive interested in protecting human rights.
So I've just put the link to the video of this hearing. It is actually quite compelling viewing. It's probably going to be more exciting than what we serve up today, Lizzie. But Ted Cruz particularly goes off the reservation. But this hearing is basically one where one side, the Democrats, are saying and they had Zuckerberg, they had Dorsey, and the head of Google, whose name I keep forgetting, basically called in front of these senators to explain what they were doing with the election. The Democrats are going, what are you doing to make sure that this whole process isn't undermined by disinformation? And you've got the Republicans saying, why aren't you allowing us to keep our disinformation spreading? And it was kind of like this two worlds colliding. So if you watch question by question, it was kind of these guys being buffeted either way. My reading of it was that Dorsey's obviously the target for the Republicans because they are being quite interventionist in flagging the rubbish that Trump's putting out there, whereas Zook almost got a free pass because there's a sense that he's actually putting his hands back a little bit. I don't know if you've seen any of it, Dan, but the other context that it might be interested in talking about, this is all being framed up as an inquiry into reviewing what's called Section 230, which was an immunity that came up in the early days of the internet, which was website publishers shouldn't be responsible for third-party content, which is really an anchor point for the libertarian, it's not out, we're just a platform, not a publisher.
Yeah, so look, I'm not an expert on 230, but I know a little bit about it, obviously, as being a publisher or running a publishing company in Australia. And we have similar laws to Section 230 in Australia, similar safe harbour provisions, as I understand it in Australia. But just for everyone's benefit, I think, just in case anyone's not aware of what 230 does, I'll give you my very pedestrian sort of explanation of it. Basically, what it means is that, yes, as Peter mentioned, platforms like Facebook and Google, even The Guardian, by the way, aren't necessarily liable for consumer comments on their respective platforms. But what Section 230 does is it also gives platforms the protection that they can go in and after the fact, they can take down comments they deem to be harmful or the like, without necessarily assuming all liability, if you like, for any defamation or harm that might come from taking an interventionist sort of attitude towards those sort of things. So it sort of skates this middle ground, if you like. I've no doubt done a pretty ham-fisted job of explaining that. Lizzie, you can clean this up later. But look, I think what the problem with 230 is it's become a law which gives these platforms free rein to sort of argue that they're always doing enough because they're not liable for the comments that consumers post on their platforms, and further to that, they're not liable if they take action on some comments and don't take action on others, because Section 230 is such a vague and ambiguous sort of protection, if you like. What I think is good though about this, and I'm going to echo some of the comments that Lizzie mentioned earlier, I also agree with a lot of the points that Ted Cruz was making, which was a rather uncomfortable position to be in for me too. But I think it is good that we're finally getting over this complete charade that the platforms themselves aren't responsible for their algorithms and the surfacing of their content. So, you know, it is high time that people started to consider that the algorithms that Google and Facebook and Twitter in particular use to surface particular kinds of content have consequences, and you can no longer argue the Section 230 protection against that. I think it was a pretty crude and sort of yo-yoing hearing, but at the same time, I think it's the start of a conversation that we've needed to have for a long time. So hopefully it can proceed to something a little bit more meaningful over the coming weeks and months.
So that was only part of what seemed like a bit of a legislative full court press on the big tech companies in hopefully the last couple of weeks of Trump administration, Lizzie. The other big development over the last fortnight was the filing of the antitrust case against Google.
Yeah.
It feels really technical as someone who doesn't really understand it, but it seems also like a big deal. This is the first big tech antitrust since Microsoft 20 years ago. What's behind it? Why is the Department of Justice doing it now, and what's likely to come out the other end?
Yeah, so the Department of Justice has been investigating this case for nearly 18 months. It's about the same amount of time that the congressional inquiry was investigating the big tech companies, and that resulted in a hearing a couple of months ago now, I think, interrogating them about their powers and how they might behave like monopolies. So it's about the same time at which there was an appetite for regulators, for lawmakers to consider how these companies might be operating in breach of various antitrust provisions. So the key act in the United States is the Sherman Act. I think it's a really interesting act, actually, because most people think about antitrust and competition law as being about protecting consumers. But, Sherman himself, the senator who introduced the act at the time in the 19th century, he was talking about the importance of making sure that large companies don't impact democracy, that actually when market power centralizes in few firms, that can have a huge impact on how laws get made, how democratic representatives serve the populace that elects them. And so in any event, that's the act that we're talking about here. And Section 2 makes it illegal for a single company to monopolize, attempt to monopolize, or combine or conspire to monopolize. And so what essentially the DOJ is saying is that Google gained or maintained monopoly power using abusive conduct or abuse of their market position. In essence, it looks at a few different issues, but particularly, for example, the one that's often talked about is paying someone like Apple to make your search engine, Google, the default search engine when you use an Apple product. And Google pays Apple between $8 and $12 billion a year to do that, which is a considerable sum of money, and preserves their market position as a dominant search engine. I think it raises a few questions, like how do these platforms become so good? Because often they're well liked by consumers. Like if you ask users in surveys, they'll often rate Google as being a good service provider. But it's one of those things where I think it depends the kind of question that you ask. Someone once said to me that the definition of capitalism is endless choice about things that don't really matter. And I think in some ways you can ask that question here about Google. So it might be a product that people prefer, but if you ask them about privacy issues or what power Google might have over you to take data and use it for other purposes, they might feel differently. But it's usually, the comparison is not made in that way. It's, do you prefer this to, say, Bing or to some other search engine? So, when people are defending this particular case, they often are saying, well, it might not be about price because you don't pay to use Google as a user, but it might be about other things like privacy and the capacity for Google to crush other competitors by locking up the market for search through these choke points, the Apple agreement being one such example.
So of all the things I worry about big tech, it doesn't seem to be at the top of my list that if I get an iPhone, Google's the default. Why should we be worried? Like, why is this the biggest game in town?
Well, the argument is that other competitors can't compete. So that's bad, obviously, for those companies that are perhaps producing a superior product but can't get it in front of users. part of the reason why Google is able to constantly improve its product is because people also use it, so they get that kind of feedback and they can learn more about their users. They also have multiple different services that are used by Google which feed the improvement of search, search being the primary way in which consumers engage with them, but search is then used to also improve other products. So they're a platform across multiple different services that they provide a product, often for free, not always for free, but they're mutually reinforcing. So it's not just crushing search competitors, but potentially other competitors as well. I think that's part of it. I mean, I think the capacity for these companies to aggregate vast amounts of data about users, about how the economy works, does also mean that there's immense resources at their disposal to then influence how regulation might take place, to fend off the prospect of regulation, but also to shape that regulation when it's put in place. I mean, it's a really interesting time because people are making a lot of comparisons with Microsoft, for example, and there's still kind of differing views about what the impact was of that particular antitrust case against Microsoft. There's a view that it didn't make any difference because Microsoft is still around and a massive company. There's a view that it made an enormous difference because within the company, they became very concerned about potentially breaching antitrust laws and more conservative in how they developed products as a result. And in fact, you couldn't, there's an argument that you wouldn't have had Google if Microsoft had been allowed to continue its dominance. And there's various, counter criticisms of that argument in and of itself. But I think the point is that there is a role to play, I think, for regulators in bringing this kind of litigation and to sit on our hands and to not prosecute these things does permit, I think, anti-competitive conduct to continue, which does damage the, supposed market that exists in the United States for these kinds of products to arise on merit rather than an accumulation of capital and power that allows that continued dominant market position.
Dan, it has certainly set off a raging debate amongst sort of the tech inside community. Do you want to just chart the to and fro that's going on there on the value of this particular case?
Well, yeah, there's an extensive debate. I mean, just before I dive into that, for what it's worth, I definitely fall into the latter category that you just described, Lizzie, of whether that Microsoft case had a big difference. I truly believe that Google wouldn't have become the dominant company or the large company that is today if it wasn't for effectively Microsoft being forced to disaggregate Internet Explorer, because without that, Bing would have almost certainly been the default search engine, an inferior product as it was, and it would have, I think, really stifled Google and perhaps other search engines' growth. And I think this gets to the heart of it. So, look, I think this is probably an obvious point, but it's worth taking a step back, and this I think gets to the heart of where there's this sort of big debate going on within the tech community. And antitrust cases historically, in the early part of last century, typically focused on companies' control of supply. So you had, Standard Oil, you had AT&T, you had companies effectively controlling the parts which consumers then use to access whatever the good or service it was. In the internet age, that's switched. So now the big internet companies don't so much control supply, but they control consumer demand. And so the harm is less obvious there because most of these products are free because they're ad supported. And so it looks like consumers are getting a fantastic deal. But the problem with that is that what then Google and Facebook and many other companies, Amazon and the like, then use once they control consumer demand, if they then use that to stifle competition of others that might rival their services, but two, also get worse terms, if you like, or demand worse terms for their suppliers. And as a result of that, consumers still suffer, but it's just a less obvious sort of harm. And so I think this action that the DOJ has taken against Google is a promising place to start, actually, because it does get to the heart of this particular problem. And that is that Google, I think, did rise on the basis they had a superior product, and all power to them for that. That's how companies should rise. But they then used the revenue they've made for that, they've used to solidify their control of consumer demand through these deals that they have with being the default search engine on Safari and on Firefox, through the acquisition of many companies, including the Android operating system, which again allowed them to control consumer demand of search on Android devices. This is a fairly obvious or fairly winnable part, if you like, of where the DOJ can take on Google. I hope that it's the start and not the end, because there are so many other areas which I think the Google in particular is operating in an anti-competitive way. I'm hoping that they win this case and it becomes the start of many actions to follow.
So my final question before we come more locally is, assuming, and we shouldn't, that there is a change in administration and you might have, an Elizabeth Warren in the cabinet, is this going to be the vehicle on which progressives would also, the idea of breaking up big tech, holding it to account? Is this the vehicle, or will that be a totally parallel exercise, do you think, Lizzie?
So, do you mean the litigation will be a parallel exercise, or let me?
Or will this become the vehicle for the showdown?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, I have to say, I do think the idea that all these products are meritorious and the best one always rises to the top of the market is a bit of a fantasy, to be honest. I think there's many other factors which give rise to good products failing, and also good products going a lot further than they ought through savvy business practices and strategies and marketing and the like, and accumulation of power or acquisition. So a good product might be excellent, then it gets acquired by a big tech platform and becomes worse, or sometimes it becomes better, but it may be also crushed and killed. So how the market works, I don't think is always meritorious. And then, of course, the overlay of monopolistic power within it can definitely make it worse. So what I'm getting at there, though, is I do think we need to start thinking a little more broadly than just how we've treated antitrust in the past. I think we do need to think about abuse of market power is a key way in which antitrust comes to the fore, and this is the basis of this litigation. But I don't think we should be permitting consumer welfare to be the key defining characteristic of how we understand these markets as being either competitive or anti-competitive, or free and open or not. I don't think we want to preserve particular players at their particular status within these markets either. So I'm much more interested in things like demergers. Like, I don't think it is appropriate that Facebook owns Instagram and WhatsApp, two very similar services. I don't think it's a good thing that Amazon owns Whole Foods, which is a bricks and mortar version of what they, of a supermarket, but it's a supermarket, but it's what they also offer on their online platform. I think those kinds of things are quite important. And I wonder whether that will be something that is pursued through lawmakers if the administration changes, or the DOJ. I can't see the DOJ taking on another such case like this anytime quickly, because they're an institution that has limited resources. So I do think if the administration changes, I would hope that lawmakers are a bit more ambitious in what they like to see from antitrust law, and including amending things as needed and looking back on past decisions, but to potentially revisit them, but also making sure that those decisions aren't permitted in future. Because a lot of the mergers that I just talked about were approved, by the relevant regulator, and that's a problem. That suggests, I think, that the test needs to change, and I would hope that if there is a change of administration, that's the kind of mandate they would run with.
There's a raging debate going on in chat about the merits or otherwise of DuckDuckGo. Craig has also suggested some alternate platforms, LastPass and Dashlane. I must say, I've shifted to DuckDuckGo. It's not as good as Google, but if you don't want to be tracked, I basically use search to cheat on the cryptic crossword, and it's totally adequate. It's because it picks up Dan words, so that's all you really need when you're grappling with DA on a Friday. Dan, going closer to home, the ACCC put out a fresh report that actually looked specifically at the structure and the way that the instant messaging is working in Australia. You sort of give us a top line for those that didn't have time to read the 180 odd pages that the ACCC put out this week.
Sure, I can give you some parts, but I didn't read all 180 pages as well. I did read.
You're fired. You're meant to do all the boring stuff.
But yeah, look, this is a report that the ACCC, an interim report the ACCC. I think this is something they're going to be doing every 6 months, actually, off the back of the digital platforms inquiry that we've spoken about lots in this forum. But yeah, it looked at messaging platforms, and I guess the potential concentration around those. Particularly, it looked at Apple's messaging platform versus WhatsApp. And it also looked at an increase in the market power of Google and Facebook and their data collection capabilities since the last report was published some 6 months ago. The two things really struck me about this report. The first one was that Google and Facebook have increased their market share of digital advertising from 71% to 81% in the space of just over a year. So just to put that in context, they have gained an additional 10% share of the entire digital advertising market, the largest advertising market, in less than, I think, 18 months or thereabouts. I mean, that is remarkable. And again, I'm gonna try and keep my publisher hat off today. But if you think about it, every other publisher is now competing for 19% of the digital advertising market. If that's not a concentration of power and a problem that suggests these companies should be broken up, I don't know what is. I'm 100% in agreement with you, Lizzie. There is no reason why Facebook should be allowed to continue to own Instagram. And you could go down a very long list of companies on both Google and Facebook's side and Amazon's side as well. So that's the first point. The other point, though, which I was particularly disturbed by, is that if it analysed the top 1,000 websites in Australia, and it found that Google collects data for the purposes of running their targeted advertising business on 80% of them. 80%. So 4 out of every 5 websites that everyone on this call goes to, Google is collecting data from you. Now, we've touched on some of this before in the context of publishers, but I think that just demonstrates just how wide-ranging Google's tentacles are across the internet. Facebook is much lower, but still, in my view, very, very concerning. They collect data on 40% of the top 1,000 websites in Australia. And that's done through use of companies that use their business tools or their like buttons and the like that exist on many publisher sites. It's everywhere. Now, I know I keep banging on about this, and I no doubt sound like a broken record, but the ability for these companies to be able to collect data on such a wide-ranging number of websites that have often nothing to do with their business, I think most consumers would be surprised by that. And most consumers, if they understood it, would have a problem with that. And again, there needs to be regulation around this to prevent Google, for example, being able to aggregate not only the data it collects from publisher websites, but also from the data it collects from maps and it collects from the Chrome browser, because ultimately that is used to power their digital advertising business. And ultimately that leads to the surveillance capitalism business model, which we've spoken about many times on this in this forum, but I think which we all have a problem with.
So they put out this report. What happens now? Is that just they go, so there, or?
Well, good question. I mean, I think this, if anything, just underscores the need for the government to take action on the privacy regulations that we've touched on here. And as I understand it, there is serious work going on at the federal government level on this, and I am expecting some announcements on this shortly. But I'm hoping that that's the main point. I'm hoping that the government reads this, takes it seriously, and starts. This gives it even more reason to follow through on the many recommendations that the ACCC made in their digital platforms inquiry report some 12 months ago or thereabouts.
In other ACCC news, Lizzie, the shocking news, I know that a project that was run by the big tech lobby group Digi to write its own industry code for dealing with disinformation has been found to be inadequate by the authority ACMA that actually agreed to allow them to do this. A, does this surprise you? And B, what do you think about the idea of industry lobby groups writing industry codes?
Yeah, well, to answer the first question first, I mean, I think it is an attempt to begin the process of self-regulation to see if it works, and then if it doesn't, consider alternative methods. So, I mean, I don't love that idea, but I think it is something that does commonly happen. I mean, I say this as a member of the legal profession, which is self-regulated, although I would argue that our self-regulation works very well. But, you know, so it's not unprecedented, but it is kind of classically LNP and a tendency that we see to favour self-regulation over other forms of regulation that might be more transparent and accountable. Having said all that, I do worry about regulating disinformation. I think it is a difficult task. And what we were talking about before, like what is the role of some of these platforms? Are they publishing content, or are they just the pipes and switches through which other people publish content? And I think they're neither of those extremes. They're somewhere in the middle. So what do you do about that? They have to make qualitative decisions about disinformation if they are to regulate it. And that invariably invites then quite a bit of debate and discussion about what that looks like. And to the extent industry has a role to play here, I think they often like to emphasise the use of automated processes because I think it makes them look really fancy. Or we've got these, you know, really sophisticated ways of tracking disinformation and stopping it in its tracks. I don't think that usually cuts it. And I think we have to start talking about other things like, for example, how do you allow content to become viral? How do you make decisions about what gets presented to which audience? Why are you permitting micro-targeting, which might increase the incentive to build an algorithm in a particular way that polarizes people, and those kinds of questions, which are much more substantive. They're never going to be covered in a disinformation code like this, in a self-regulation code like this, but they're kind of deep philosophical questions, I suppose, that I think we benefit from having a pretty public debate about, and lawmakers, pin their colours to the mast so we can judge them on election day as to whether that's sufficient for our purposes. And this may be the first step towards that, but I'm sort of not surprised that it's a difficult topic, and I'm sort of not surprised that when left to their own devices, they don't really come up with something that's going to.
So, I think the debate, there's one level that sort of would say you accept that a platform by its nature, you can't have a gate for content to get on. Then there's an exception that certain material when flagged should be taken down. And then the grey area in the middle are what are the rules that identify things that are meeting that sort of definition of disinformation, and what do you do with that? And that's where I've got a little bit of sympathy for what Twitter's trying to do with things like, which I think is a really cute idea, that it makes it harder for you just to automatically retweet a link to something else. You've actually got to go in there, and it picks up if you've actually gone in there and looked at it before it gets retweeted, which makes it harder for a bot to do that work. So there are things that can be done. I think what shone out though in the Digi attempt was it was a very minimalist approach. It was almost like a value statement rather than an action plan, Dan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was basically saying, look at all the things we've done and technology will fix this in the future, don't worry, which I think is often the response from these platforms, which is hugely problematic. I think we did touch on this at the start of the call, but I think it is worth revisiting. I mean, I agree, I think the point you made, Lizzie, in that these platforms shouldn't be, stop people from posting to their own respective pages. But as I've said many times, they are responsible for the amplification of that content. So just take one product, right? Take Facebook's newsfeed. So Facebook's newsfeed is no one's responsibility except Facebook. And I think we've kind of been fed this lie that it's all this algorithmically generated thing, which happens automatically, and the genie's out of the bottle and no one can do anything about it. It's like, that's rubbish. It's like the Facebook newsfeed didn't exist for a substantial part of Facebook's life. And ultimately, the only company that should be responsible for what appears in the Facebook newsfeed is Facebook. So you can't just say, oh, sorry, the scale is so large, we can't manage this anymore. It's like, well, the scale is so large and your profits are reflective of that. So perhaps use some of those profits to take moderation seriously. I think coming back to this particular point, though, with regards to disinformation, the problem that we run into often with disinformation, I think, is that it is such a wide-ranging subjective topic. I think we're probably going to have more success if we start biting off parts which are less ambiguous. I mean, disinformation regarding flat Earth is, I think, a pretty straightforward thing that we can all agree on. Let's make it mandatory that the platforms can't amplify that information. Similar with anti-vaxxer information. I mean, I know there are going to be differing views on this, but I think the problem is if you just start saying disinformation as broad as what we have, it becomes so big you can't tackle it. I think you need to actually bite off specific pieces of information, anti-Holocaust kind of information, those sorts of things, for example, which there'd be 90+% agreement on that this is not real information, and then make the platforms responsible for taking that down. And that then doesn't give them any kind of leave pass to say, oh, it's ambiguous and there's different subjective views in regards to this topic, and then we build on it from there and see how far we can go. Yeah.
I would just throw in a pitch there. I think Peter and I were talking about it. I don't disagree, except maybe the subject matter approach. There's other ways we could pursue this, because you can see how Holocaust denial might be a reasonable topic to consider to be classified as disinformation, but you can see it's not a very far leap to get to arguments about how anti-Semitism might be characterised as applying to criticisms of Israel, which is a very contentious topic, as you can imagine, across the world. And you just need to look at what happened in the UK overnight with the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn from the Labor Party around these issues of what constitutes anti-Semitism and what isn't. Like, it's not that I particularly want to litigate that here. It's that they're very contentious issues of which there's a long history of debate about. And even the most simple kind of ideas that we can all agree are perhaps bad do quickly bleed into other issues that are far more contentious and grey. So my alternative suggestion perhaps is to think about it perhaps in more engineering terms. How can we stop bots, for example? How can we stop or limit virality? Let's talk about what constitutes something that's viral, and who's making that call, who's allowing these things to get accelerated, and what kind of quality of decision making goes on there. Also, there's a couple. I mean, there's also like micro targeting, I suppose, which is a slightly more sophisticated concept, but it does incentivize polarization. So should we limit what kind of ad content audiences you can supply content to? Is it okay for them to be automatically generated? There's been demonstrations among journalists about how automatically generated audience fields include things like anti-Semites and pro-Nazi that are automatically generated by someone like Facebook or someone like Google because they know those users exist and they're trying to supply a service to advertisers. So you could do those kinds of technical things that I think could satisfy this without necessarily having to ask these questions about substantive subject matter. And that might be a better place to start biting off things that you can chew, because I agree with Dan, that's absolutely where we need to go.
A couple of questions. I'll call up Craig. You had a really interesting comment about the idea of tracking bots. You there, Craig? You may or may not be there. I think you've unmuted. No, I'm going to ask you to unmute one more time. Otherwise, and you there?
I think so. But, I mean, I think we can cut some of this. I think it's one part of Monday we can go and manage it. But I think
We're not hearing that, are we, guys?
I'm certainly not. I'd love to.
Okay, sorry. Try it one more time. Dylan also made the point this could be the worst, or is the worst kind of techno-solutionism, even with flat Earth misinformation. How do you detect people being sarcastic about flat earthers?
Yes, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So you have to start somewhere. That's my point, right? This is the argument that I think gives the tech platforms a lead pass, is that they say the ambiguity that exists around it, they use as the reason for not taking action, and that's not acceptable in my view.
I'm also going to ask Dean to make a contribution, see if I can run the machine this time properly. Are you there, Dean?
Yeah, I'm here.
So you had a question more about an analogy with news agents, that there used to be regulation on information.
I think in the end, it comes down to the notion of content. Content creators, distributors, and retailers, in effect, and obviously consumers. And we historically used to regulate quite tightly the old news agencies, if there are still any around. We don't have one where I live now anymore, nearby. And there were things that they were not allowed to put on the shelf, or if they were allowed to sell them at all, they might have to be under the counter, or they might have to have some kind of protection mechanism, or put out a certain position.
Are you betraying your reading habits there, Dean?
No. But in a sense, I agree with Dan in his kind of analysis of that Facebook news feed. For me, that it's essentially is the retail point of the platform. It's the space in which Facebook gets to put something in front of people to sell shit. And they use it, that environment, to attract people. Click on this, click on this, click on this. So the concept of regulation, there's multiple touch points of regulation. It's not we just regulate this platform. It's actually, well, how do we regulate the distribution? How do we regulate the retail end? How do we know who the consumer is? And that the consumer should actually be in this relationship in the first place. This person's 12. Why are they having access to this content? And the regulation of content, well, if you're regulating the rest of that chain, over time you mitigate that risk of stuff that really ought not to be broadly available is not made broadly available.
Thanks, Dean. You had a really bad connection, but I think most of us got the gist of that. Do either of you guys want to respond, or were we just not in agreement? I think there is an obligation there.
To be honest, Peter, I was struggling to hear it, so I might let Lizzie comment.
Yeah, well, I do think it's interesting. Like, we often think about things like we regulate when advertising might be able to appear for alcohol or junk food on television, but we don't really think about that in terms of social media. Do we hive off, for example, we have YouTube Kids, but does that create a greater obligation at law for YouTube to make sure that that content is appropriate for children? But, you know, Facebook does know who you are when you sign up. You have to give them your birth date. Does that create an extra obligation upon them legally to make sure you're not exposed to things that aren't appropriate for you if you're under 18, if you're a minor, if you can't, you know, at law, consent to certain things? And I don't, you know, the current position is that those kinds of broadcast codes or advertising codes don't apply to social media, but there's a real question as to whether they should, because they are in that marketplace. They're still taking money from advertisers. I mean, I think about a lot of this from the perspective of gambling, which is another issue that I'm interested in. I sit on the board of a gambling reform organisation. You know, gambling organisations and companies, they try to recruit children, and that's why they sponsor a lot of sport and things that children are interested in, to get them inculcated into a culture in which gambling is part of your social life, your sporting life. And you can see how that could take form in social media platforms as well. And currently we're not, our government and our laws don't really protect children in the way that I think they ought, and the way that they do on things like television, for example. So I think there's definitely scope to consider how these things could be applied in social media contexts, particularly for advertising.
Can I just jump in here, just because I think I understood it now? Sorry, Peter. Very quick point. I just broadly in agreement with what Lizzie said, and again, it touches on something which we've said many times on this in this forum before, and that is that there is no regulation around what people can do with targeted advertising. And you know, another example, as I think you sort of touched on, I mean, there's YouTube Kids, but for example, on Saturday morning television, there is real limits around what you can both put on there for children in terms of content, but also who can advertise against that. Those limits don't exist, and yet you can target children so much more effectively, or young people at least, so much more effectively than you used to be able to because of all of these platforms. And again, it just demonstrates the point, this is still the Wild West. There still needs to be regulation to catch up with the fact that all of these norms that we've established in the traditional media world need to be brought over into the internet world, because it's in fact probably more important, because the targeting is at a more superior level.
Now Peter's on mute.
Peter's on mute. Rookie error.
I've got to
You
buy
think you've never done this before?
I've got to buy the drinks this week. Thanks, guys. Look, I'm really excited now to hand the floor over to our friends from Monash Uni. So the master's course have been doing a lot of research into technology, and Centre for Responsible Technology has been working with them to sort of give a bit of a roadmap of gaps in research. So one of the prizes for being part of this project was an opportunity to present some of the research to our wonderful community. So I'm going to hand over to Magda, who runs the master's course, to just introduce the guys today who have done some research into the COVID Safe app to share with you guys. So are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you for having us coming along today. We're really, really excited to be able to present some of the research our students have done. So just to give you a quick background, my name is Mugdha Rai. I work in the School of Media, Film and Journalism at Monash University. And this semester I'm looking after a capstone unit our master's students do called Industry Project. And our students work in consultancy teams to do research for an external organisation. So this semester we're working with the Centre for Responsible Technology. So all our student teams have been doing research around sort of contemporary concerns around digital technologies and issues of citizen rights. And so we're sort of nearing the end of our semester, and most of them have now wrapped up their research and have some really wonderful findings to present. So one of our teams will present their research for you today in a moment. This is Team 9. The topic of their research was they actually had a look at COVID tracking apps. The COVID Safe app here in Australia, and they've compared it to apps in other countries. And they're really interested in looking at it around issues of surveillance and data leakage. And so I'm going to hand over to them in a moment. So Group 9 consists of Dwarak Balasubramaniam, Jaya Domingo, Juosi Lee, Yilian Ma, and Shiyu Xiao. So I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thanks, Mr. Lewis, for having us here. I'd just like to ask Jaya to share her screen, and then we can get started with the presentation.
There you go. Can you see the screen?
Yep, perfect.
So our project is essentially a comparison between two COVID-19 contact tracing apps, which are COVID Safe from Australia and the Alipay Health Code from China. As we can see from the news article headlines, surveillance in online public spaces is increasingly being used by not only corporations, but also governments, and even more so now with the pandemic and just the need to track and contain new cases. And besides Australia and China, other countries have also rolled out COVID-19 contact tracing apps like Trace Together by Singapore, Stop COVID by France, Immunai by Italy, and Arogya Setu by India. So China is well known for its surveillance system, so it's no surprise that they've taken the lead in using mobile surveillance, which in this case is the Alipay Health Code for to track COVID-19 cases. Surveillance in Australia is also on the rise with the rollout of COVID Safe. And with the rollout of COVID Safe, concerns over the possibility of surveillance creep and data repurposing on the app has also arisen. So just a little background information on who's involved in the development of the apps. China's contact tracing apps is hosted on two platforms, which are WeChat and Alipay, the two most popular private platforms in China. And Australia's COVID Safe was developed in collaboration with Amazon Web Services, which obviously is a US-based entity. And ultimately, our project aims to explore possibilities of surveillance creep, as well as stuff like who's collecting the data, how it's being managed, and where it's being stored. Any potential loopholes for an unhealthy nexus between public and private actors, whether any safeguards have been put into place to prevent the commodification of data. And we also investigate who's involved in the development and implementation of the apps. We audit discourses of security and safeguards available in these apps. And we also benchmark the legal framework within which these apps operate. And now I will hand over to Dwarak, who will talk about our key findings and takeaways.
Thank you so much. As reiterated, our research design is based on a comparative analysis between the two cases. Next slide, please. I'll quickly run over some of the key findings that we've encountered in this. Next slide, please. In the case of COVID Safe in Australia, I think the key finding for us was that there were ambiguities in the app functionality. If we understood that the government and the privacy policy of COVID Safe had clearly stated that the app does not collect location data. But when I used the app for about a month or so, the app categorically asks people to turn on location services when you sign up for the app at the registration page. It states that it needs location permission for the app to function properly. So obviously there is an ambiguity there. A decentralized data collection process means that all user data is stored on the phones and it is only uploaded to a national COVID Safe data store only after user consent. So this partially helps allay fears of data misuse. It's been over 6 to 7 months since the app has been developed. And over the course of this period, numerous bugs have been identified. For instance, the app and the privacy policy states that it only collects digital handshakes at a distance of 1.5 meters for 15 minutes or more. However, an official privacy impact assessment of the app is revealed that's not the case. So there is no legal or factual basis for that. Besides these, there are other issues. iPhone functionality continues to be a problem. Some early versions of the app also incorrectly informed users of a positive diagnosis, causing a lot of confusion. And in terms of the legal framework, the federal government promulgated the Privacy Amendment Act of 2020, which governs the functionality of COVID Safe. And it also highlights, the kind of safeguards that are available. Despite this, there are some evident gaps in legislation. For example, the Data Retention Act in Australia, which requires internet service providers and telecom service providers to retain metadata for a minimum of 2 years. So this is in contradiction to the Privacy Amendment Act, which says that it does not store any form of data. Next slide, please. Moving on to China and the health code. From the outset, the health code is much more intrusive because it brings together data from different streams, not just those that users generate, but those kinds of data which the Communist Party already has access to in terms of data from civil aviation sector, the banking, health sector, etc. Unlike COVID Safe, the health code is a mere feature which runs on a third-party platform, which is Alipay or WeChat. Therefore, it lacks an explicit privacy policy, which means that users do not have a clear idea of who's in charge of collecting the data, who has access to the data, what kinds of data is being collected, how will it be used, etc. Unlike COVID Safe, the health code follows a centralized data collection system, which means that it targets all citizens, irrespective of whether they're healthy or they've been diagnosed positive for coronavirus. So the aspect of user choice also gets thrown out of the window because the feature is automatically built in on Alipay and WeChat, so users do not get a choice to opt out on that. Also, data, in terms of the legal regulations in China, data security is partially provided for by a mishmash of laws, which are inadequate and which are inconsistent with the rapidly developing nature of this field. In the case of legal provisions in China, they provide some basic protection against private corporations, but the public sector surveillance is mostly unregulated. So that is a cause of concern. A major development came in 2016 in the form of the Chinese cybersecurity law, which brought China partly in line with global standards in data protection. Unfortunately, the cybersecurity law also has certain flaws. For example, the way personal information has been defined is inconsistent, and therefore it requires, it warrants attention. Next slide, please. Now, what all of these findings, and there are much more which we'd like to share with you once we're done with this report. Now, what all of these findings boils down to is this, that A, there are apparent contradictions between the privacy policy and actual functionality of the apps. In the case of Alipay, the absence of an explicit privacy policy means that there are increased chances of data misuse. Next slide, please. Both COVID Safe and the health code have been developed by governments, but being managed by private corporations. So there is an unhealthy nexus where data management is not transparent. And it is unclear whether these private corporations will have access to all of this data and whether there are possibilities of data repurposing. In the case of COVID Safe, Amazon Web Services is the entity which is responsible for data storage. As Jaya mentioned, Amazon Web Services being a US-based entity, it is subject to the US Cloud Act of 2018, which stipulates that all US-based corporations will have to hand over the data that they store, irrespective of geographic considerations. To a certain extent, it can be argued that the health code has not achieved the same level of transparency as COVID Safe. The absence of an explicit privacy policy means that there is no informed consent from Chinese citizens. And most importantly, it is an invitation for private corporations to exploit user data in what Zuboff terms surveillance capitalism. And finally, it's also important to highlight that in the case of Chinese legislation, the thrust of the cybersecurity law, which was passed in 2016, is to protect Chinese cyberspace sovereignty rather than data protection. So it can be argued that China still does not have an explicit data protection law. Next slide, please. Just to wrap things up, what all of this means is we are not arguing through this project. We're not trying to argue that contact tracing apps and governments or the people involved in the development of these apps, they engage in mass surveillance. We're not trying to argue that they engage in mass surveillance. We just want to ask, what if they engage in mass surveillance? Are there any guardrails to prevent misuse? And the next step for us is to actually come up with recommendations on how governments and private corporations can regain some of the lost trust by doing better than the bare minimum. Thank you so much for that. We'd like to take questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, guys. It was fascinating. Do you want to stop the share screen as well there? That's great. It's fascinating to actually have somebody have a look at how the Chinese app works. My gut tells me it's probably been a little bit more effective in terms of its key role of tracking COVID than the Australian model, but I don't know if you actually looked into that as well.
Certainly. In the case of both Alipay, it runs on Alipay as well as WeChat. And it brings together, like I mentioned in my presentation, it brings together data from different streams. So it's much more effective in that sense. And now that I think there are no cases in China, but the feature continues to be in use. And I doubt that the Communist Party will be willing to, work on gradually rolling back the use, because if it's, if there are no cases and if everything's fine, then why do we need the app?
Lizzie, a good model for Australia?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm so glad that you guys have done that research and shared it with us, because it wasn't that long ago that Scott Morrison was talking about this is the need to wear sunscreen is like the need to download COVID safe apps. And I think it's really important that after the hype has died down, we have a reflection on whether these things work and on what stopped them from working or what made them better. I mean, one of the things that sort of occurred to me, and you're talking about like the legislation, the other things outside the technical design of the app, which is its own kind of field, is that there's a lot of things that exist in meat space, shall we say, that are quite relevant to the functionality of the app, including things like public trust, including things like the infrastructure that might exist to use this information. Like, what do you do with once you've identified a bunch of people who might have been exposed? Do you have contact tracing teams who can then effectively get on top of that? I don't know whether you've looked in, and of course then the comparison is with China, where there's an authoritarian system, I think it's fair to say, which might be what motivates big take up of the app. I mean, in the course of your research, did you identify any examples of good public trust and what puts faith of people into their government to be able to handle the data both correctly, but also effectively at containing the virus outside of both China and Australia, for example?
So we did come across reports, like, interestingly, the Australian public actually trusts the level of trust of the Australian public with the government on how they've handled contact tracing is significantly high, which was quite interesting, because I think in like talking generally about public trust, I think it's not that much. But so that was an interesting point for us. But I think the important point here is that with the case of COVID Safe and the Privacy Amendment Act, it clearly outlines the guardrails in that it has a clear policy on how people can access all the data that's there. There is obviously all the data from that's generated from the app is only stored on the COVID Safe National Data Store after user consent. So there is a clear policy there, and it's out there. It's just that we aren't sure if that's being followed. Obviously, it's on paper, but we can't really assert if it's being followed or not.
Dan, final questions or comments?
I just have one really specific one. Did you say that the COVID Safe app was tracking more than the 1.5 meters, 15 minutes? Do you know what it was tracking?
Yep. So the government the Department of Health commissioned a privacy impact assessment of the app. I think this was in May or mid-May or June, I suppose. So the privacy impact assessment categorically states that it collects the 1.5 meter for 15 minutes or more rule does not actually apply. So there's no factual basis for that. So it
That might be a
collects-
yarn for the Guardian, Dan.
I was going to say there could be this could be an interesting
Could be
story.
getting
By
a
the way,
call from a journalist later on today.
the next thing you guys should look at is what is happening to all the data that everyone is giving over to all the restaurants that people go to when they scan their QR code, because it is going everywhere and no one knows what's happening to it, and these companies aren't set up to deal with it. But anyway, that's perhaps a topic
Discussion
next,
for another
fortnight.
day.
Yeah,
I know, and I
they should
think
go
we-
back to a clipboard and pen. I think that would be preferable personally. But anyway, go on. Sorry, Peter.
We're just at the hour, so thanks, guys, for sharing that. I know we're going to have another group. I don't know which group it is out of 1 to 9 next time, Magda, but look forward to. I think it's a deeper dive into technology in China as well, isn't it?
Correct. It's Group 15 who'll present next fortnight, Peter, and they've actually been looking at the spread of the Me Too movement via Weibo in China, and they're comparing the spread of socially contentious issue in the Chinese media sphere and comparing it to how that network looked to the spread of it in Twitter 2 years ago.
Excellent. We look forward to that. Hey, thanks, guys, for joining us. Thanks, Dan and Lizzie. Lizzie, get outside, enjoy the air. Dan, stay in your room in Perth. I'm going to go and walk the dog. Thanks, everyone else. Have a great weekend. Thanks for being part of it. I did flag that we were going to start a bit of a discussion about what we do with this community. I love the way we're talking. I might even put a little survey out in the debrief today to start getting some people's views of what they'd like to be hearing. But I know that we're really keen to keep these discussion going long term and finding a way of making it sustainable. So thanks everyone for being part of today. Next week, we've got a really packed week on Australia at Home. For those that want to drop in, on Tuesday, the Political Geek Fest with Catherine Murphy. On Wednesday, we're just going to open the doors and have an election watch party, and anyone can drop in between 11 and 3 and share whatever they're sharing at that point. Thursday, Lizzie, your mob are partnering us to do a debrief, and I think some of Jacob's friends from the States are going to be dialing in. And, and then Friday, Helen Garner in the Guardian Book Club. So that's a really great program. We haven't been doing daily for a while, but next week, as the intensity ramps up, maybe we need to be checking in daily. But till then, everyone have a great weekend, and thanks for being part of today. See you all.